halfway. We are halfway through the year. And right now, all across the world, people are doing the same thing. They're pulling out the list they made in January, the goals they wrote down, the habits they were going to build, the person they were finally going to become in 2026. And they are running the numbers. How many mornings did I actually make it to the gym? How much of that book did I actually read? How close am I, honestly, to where I said I'll be by now? And for some of you watching, the numbers are not adding up at all. And so the narrative begins. Oh, I wasted 6 months already. I had so much time and I did nothing with it. I'm already behind again. Friends, I want to stop you right there. Not to comfort you, not to tell you that everything is fine, and not to lower the standards. I want to stop you because you're asking the wrong question. And the wrong question will always give you the wrong answer. And the wrong answer at the midpoint of a year can cost you the second half in its entirety. Stay with me as we travel this path together. Let me describe something to you. There's a very specific kind of discouragement that arrives not from failure, but from measurement. It is a discouragement that comes when you compare where you are to where you thought you would be. And right now, at the midpoint of June, that discouragement has a calendar attached to it. You made promises to yourself in January. Some of you said, this is my year. Some of you said, I'm finally going to do it. Some of you said, by mid-year, I'll be further than I have ever been. But alas, June is here. And the gap between the January version of you and the June version of you, it feels wider than you're willing to say out loud. I know that feeling, friends. I know that feeling. I know what it is to sit with a half-finished year and a fully formed sense of inadequacy. I know what it looks like at 6 months of your life and feels like the return does not match the investment. But I want to offer you something today that I believe you genuinely need. Not motivation, no. A different measuring stick entirely. Because the one you are using right now is not just inaccurate, it is also dangerous. Let me tell you what the wrong question is. The wrong question is, what did I accomplish in the past 6 months? That sounds counterintuitive. I know. You've been told, measure your results, track your wins, count your progress. And there's a place for that. I talk about that a lot on this channel. There's a place for that. But here's what happens when it becomes the only question at the midpoint of the year. It reduces your entire 6 months, all the mornings you got up anyway, all the prayers you prayed anyway, all the thought, all the quiet decisions you made that no one saw. It reduces all into a single number. And that number, for most of you, will tell you that you're behind. And it's not because you are, but because output measurement was never designed to capture formation. And formation, the slow, invisible, often painful work of becoming the person God designed, does not show up on a checklist. It never has. Let me take you somewhere on this ride. Luke chapter 2, verse 52. One of the most understated lines in all of Scripture, I will say. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. It's not Jesus completed his objectives for Q1. Not Jesus hit his milestone target by mid-year. Not Jesus posted consistent result across all measurable categories. It grew. That is the word. That is how Scripture describes the development of the Son of God. Not outputs, not accomplishment, not deliverables, growth. Invisible, slow, cumulative, unmeasurable until suddenly it becomes undeniable. And if that's how God measured the formation of Jesus in those silent years, what makes you think is measuring yours differently? Okay. I want to tell you something about Joseph. Not the Joseph who became second in command in Egypt. The Joseph nobody preaches about. The Joseph in the pit. Joseph in Potiphar's house doing everything right and still getting accused. The Joseph in prison correctly interpreting a dream for a man who forgot him for 2 full, complete years. Let me give you the timeline. Joseph was 17 when he was thrown into the pit by his own brothers. Yeah? He was 30 years old when Potiphar called his name, or Pharaoh called his name. 30 years, guys. 30 years between the promise and the platform. And if Joseph had done a mid-year audit the way you're doing now, let's say at year 1 or at year 3, or even at year 7, or even year 11, what would the output column have looked like? A slave, accused, in prison, forgotten. By any external measurement, Joseph was behind. Joseph was stuck. Joseph had nothing to show. But what was actually happening in those 13 years, he was learning how to manage Potiphar's entire household without a title. He was developing the administrative capacity that will one day save a whole nation. He was being formed in the hiddenness, in delay, in what looked to everyone else like nothing. He was not behind. He was being built. And the person who walked out of prison at year 13 was not the same 17-year-old boy who walked into the pit. The dream was the same, but the vessel had been changed completely. And I need to ask you something directly. What if the 6 months you're calling wasted were not wasted at all? What if the thing that looks like delay is actually the most productive season of your formation? What if God is not measuring your output? What if He's measuring, and what if it's just measuring your character? The patience you built in the waiting. The trust you chose when the timeline made no sense. The person you quietly became when no one was watching and nothing was happening publicly. Friends, that is nothing. It is not nothing, okay? That is everything. Because here is the truth about formation. It is not always invisible to the person going through it. You cannot see your own growth while it is happening. You cannot feel the wisdom being deposited. You cannot measure the depth being added. You cannot quantify the character being shaped in the quiet. You only know it's happened when the moment arrives that requires it. When Pharaoh calls your name, and instead of collapsing under the weight of the moment, under the weight of expectation, you find to your own surprise that you're ready. Not because you checked all the boxes, but because you were formed in the waiting. You were formed as you waited. Listen closely, my friend. You're not behind. I want you to hear that, not as comfort, not as a feeling, as a fact. You're not behind the timeline God wrote for your life. You cannot be. You can be behind the timeline you wrote. That's true. You can be behind the timeline your social media feed implies. 1,000 times yes, correct. You can be behind the timeline your comparison culture demands. But the timeline of your formation has never been yours to manage. And it has never been off schedule. Let me give you the science of this. In 1988, psychologist Carol Dweck at Stanford introduced what became one of the most replicated findings in behavioral research. She called it the growth mindset. And here's the part that most people miss in the whole research. Dweck was not studying motivation. She was studying how people respond to difficulty, specifically when their progress is invisible to them. What she found changed everything. People who measured their identity by outcomes, by visible results, they collapsed when the outcomes were delayed, when the outcomes were invisible or below expectation. But people who measured their identity by growth, they're asking the question, what am I learning? Who am I becoming? What capacity am I developing? They did not just endure difficulty, they were formed by it. They interpreted the hard season as information, not indictment. They read the delay as development, not disqualification. And the person who came out of the difficult season was measurably different from the person who went in. When you measure outcomes and the outcomes don't arrive on schedule, you conclude that you failed. But when you measure behavior, the tiny repeated decisions, the daily choice to show up even when nothing visible is happening, you begin to see what Fogg calls identity confirmation. Every time you show up, even when no one sees, even when nothing changes, even when the year is not going the way you planned, you're sending yourself a message. I'm the kind of person who keeps going. I'm the kind of person who trusts the process. I'm the kind of person who does not collapse when the timeline is longer than I expected. And that message accumulated over 6 months of quiet faithfulness is not nothing. That is identity formation. That is Joseph in Potiphar's house. That is Jesus growing in wisdom and stature. That is the slow, invisible, absolutely essential work that your media checklist cannot measure. And it was never designed to measure such things. So let me give you what I call, or what I term the right question. Not what did I accomplish in the first 6 months? Who did I become in the last 6 months? That is the media question worth asking. Not output, formation. Not productivity, character. Not what you produced, who you became in the producing. Let me ask it specifically. In the first 6 months of this year, When things did not go the way you planned, did you learn something about how you respond to disappointment? When the relationship was hard, did you grow in patience, in honesty, in the willingness to have the uncomfortable conversation rather than run away from it? When the prayer seemed unanswered, did you grow in the kind of faith that does not require visible confirmation? Those are not failure. Those are the formation records of a person being built for something larger than they currently understand. And for some of you, I know the honest answer is, I did not show up well in the first half of this year. I want to speak to you directly. The second half starts now. Not on Monday, not next month, not January. Today. Now. Because the most important thing about the media point is not that it shows you how far you have to go. It is that it shows you exactly where to start. You do not need to redo January. It's gone. You do not need a new planner, a new program, a new strategy. You need one honest decision today. One step towards the person you already knew you are built to become. Not the whole second half mapped out. One step today. Because that's how formation works. Not in grand declarations, not in grand affirmations. In daily decisions. One step today. Before we close today, I want to leave you with this image. There's a passage in Lamentations that breaks me every time I read it. Yeah. Jeremiah is sitting in the ruins of Jerusalem. Everything had fallen. Everything he loves has been destroyed. The city is unrecognizable. And in the middle of the most devastated chapter in all of scriptures, he writes this: the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never comes to an end. They are new every morning. New every morning. Not new every January, not new every new year, not new when you finally get it together. New every morning, including this one today. Including the morning after the mid-year audit that made you feel behind. Including the morning after the 6 months that did not go the way you planned. Including tomorrow's morning. The mercy of God does not operate on your calendar, my friends. It doesn't. It does not honor your January deadlines. It does not penalize your June shortfalls. It meets you exactly where the formation has brought you, and it calls the next step forward. Not the next year, the next step. You're not behind. You're not disqualified. You're not the sum of what you did not accomplish in 6 months. You're a person being formed by a God who does not waste a single season. Not the silent seasons, not the silent ones, not the painful ones, not the ones that looked from the outside like nothing is happening. Joseph was 30 years old before Pharaoh called his name. But every single one of those 13 years in the prison and the pit was preparation. The question was never, what did you produce? The question was always, who are you becoming? And I genuinely believe that the answer to that question is further along than you think. Hit the subscribe button. Subscribe to Build for More with Matt Miller for truth that will change this life. Thank you so much, friends, for your time. Do have a great day. Bye for now.